Okay, well, these dams were put in September when we had the digger here. Unfortunately, at that stage, with COVID, that the Environment Southland wasn't able to come up, and while David had designed them, he wasn't able to be here when we built them. So it was a little bit of a look at the map and between me and the digger driver, and away we went. So we haven't got them quite perfect. There's a few things I've learnt since from Keith when he was here the other day, but hopefully you'll learn from that too. But the idea of this stream was that there's quite a big catchment that goes right up into the tussock country, in fact, right up to those trees there. And it's just a slow flowing creek. It virtually almost goes dry in the summer, this one. So we just had no other dams, especially this far down. There is one away further up, but there's nothing down this end, and we just thought while we're in the area and this was a cropping paddock that we would put a dam in here. The other consequences you might notice is that the raff nose hopeless around here. We shifted the ducks from our duck pond, which is just into the left of the bridge down there, up to here, and they ate the raffno, which they loved. So if you want to get ducks, plant raffno. So a couple of things about the dam that Andy just pointed out to me was the fact that when I was quite young, one of the first things I did at home was build a dam in another gully over there with the dozer one day, but it wasn't until Dad came home and he said, "Oh, you pushed the dirt out underneath first, did you?" Because he could see a bit of seepage through the dam, and I just pushed it on top of grass, and it was very lucky to stay there. It is still there to this day, but it was very lucky it didn't go whoosh. So it was make sure you get it cleaned out in the bottom and then packing it down nice and firm if you're building them yourselves. And we propped some rocks. He just put rocks down that exit there to try and stop any scaring if we get a big rain event and it comes down and overflows a bit higher. So that was basically the design of it, but Keith will cover off a bit more around that than me.
As you can see, that Russell's doing some winter grazing here. That's when you're going to graze it off? Yeah,
well, I was in Swedes last year, this one, and we strip tilled it into Swedes, which we've been playing around with too, so we're not disturbing the soil so much, but we did hit one rock down here, one rather good sized rock down here, and did a little bit of damage to the strip till. So this place has probably only got some of the ground, but our other two farms are more suited to it. So that's certainly one of the things that we're doing too, yeah. And then this year we just dissed it and put it in like you would a kale crop, so spun it on.
Buffers along the winter grazing. But more importantly, the reason, from what I understand, is that you've got your sediment trap here because of the winter grazing catchment up above. Is that right?
Yeah, and just over time we do quite a bit of cropping in around this area because it's some of our easier country through here, so and pretty reliable. So we do have crops in here. We haven't got heaps in here this year. Most of the catchment of that one each year will go the other way, but.
And so, did you see sediment runoff because of the slope up further? Or?
Not specifically. At times you can, obviously you get a big rain in the winter. There's probably a classic one across here. David Moat had a look at that. That was young grass last year, and you can probably still see down the edges where we had the electric fence line where all the thistles are. That's about where the line we had the gullies fenced off in the winter, and he was quite happy considering it was a steep paddock what we'd done there to keep stock away from the gullies. And of course you had long grass like this, and we only grazed it very lightly once we took the at the end of the winter with might have been some rams I think we shoved in there just to chew it down a wee bit before we cultivate it and put it into grass. So because that is getting up near that sort of slope degree or range, there's patches on it that are hitting that target, or just hitting that target, not big areas but little areas of it. So
we're looking at a couple of different types of ways of controlling and trapping sediment here and contaminants, is that right?
Yep, that's right, and particularly from your farm plan, you'll identify that and break it down, and it's always prevention first. So you want to keep the sediment and contaminants in the paddock if you can, and that's why the way you graze it, the way you cultivate it, and the stock type, like heavier stock on flatter ground, lighter stock on steeper stuff, and big buffers at the bottom. And then you might not choose to winter graze some paddocks because you just know that you can't keep it on those paddocks, and then you come down, and this is what you do last when you've finished all your management options and you've put in fencing and done everything else that you can. But it's still good. You just have to put it in its place. So it's hard to get the order of things right, but sediment traps definitely have their place.
So what would you call, what type of sediment trap would you call this? Is this
I'd call that a sediment trap with a bund. You've got two options when you build a sediment trap. You can excavate or you can put a bund. Often you'd end up doing both, but you want to minimise the earthworks, and so it depends on the site. This sort of narrows in nicely just here. It's sort of similar most of the way up, but often in gullies there'll be an area that's narrow, and that's where you look to put the sediment trap. And in this case, This is a 87 hectare catchment, which is quite large for a sediment trap. I have complicated maths, which I can go into if you're curious, but because it's already got some sediment attenuation with the natural vegetation that's growing right down the bottom here, it should be okay. But yeah, for an 87 hectare catchment, you'd be looking at a much larger sediment trap to get reductions in the NIWA guide. But that takes into account there being no vegetation, and the only thing stopping sediment is the sediment trap. So that isn't the case here, so this is why we can come a bit smaller.
So hang on, let's just define that, because what Keith's saying here is that this is just a part of a sediment reduction further on up.
Yep.
So what would you class, that's a critical source area, is that right?
A vegetated critical source area.
Vegetated.
Yep.
So what benefit and what is it doing basically for capturing contaminants and sediment?
Yeah, you can imagine during rainfall, as water's flowing off the hill, it has to percolate through this vegetation, and those tussocks there and the rank grass, it tends to be a bit rougher right down the bottom there. That slows the water down more so than on a quite a grazed down paddock, and particularly because the water's concentrating in there, so there's a higher flow, and that's why the vegetation's really helping.
So if we fence that area off completely, the critical source area, which is what standard, what ES recommends or what good farming practices recommend, how would that impact on that area?
It would help the vegetation grow a bit denser, and it would keep the stock out, because the other option or consequence of having a bit more vegetation down the bottom is stock can come camping there. So if you both avoid the camping and the vegetation is thicker, then it helps really prevent sediment coming off the hill.
So to improve what the fantastic work that Russell's already done here, so an improvement piece could be actually to potentially to fence off part of or the vegetative area.
Yep. And particularly you'll be able to follow it. Now that there's the sediment trap here, the speed that it fills up will give you an indication of how much you're losing. And so if it fills up really fast, then you might look at either building more or fencing off the gully. If it's not filling up very fast, then you might have an indication that your management and your prevention further up on the paddock is working quite well.
So Russell, what sort of maintenance do you do here? I mean, do you get the bulldozer in here and try and
Not the
butcher it
bulldozer.
again?
No, well we've had summer, and there's a pond over there. My father built a duck pond when I was a kid, and we had the digger in there now, and it's probably 4 or 5 times the size area of that, probably 5 or 6 actually,
yeah.
And it was virtually silted right up. It had filled right up with silt, so there was a lot of silt in there, and the only trouble with that was it wasn't designed to be cleaned out, so the digger can only go across the dam and clean so much out, and then it sort of flows into it, and next time he's in the area we'll do that again. So probably our plan going forward is we'll just clean these out when we've got a digger in the area, when I think they're getting near that stage of needing it. If we're doing some other work around, because the cost of going around the whole farm and doing them, it's the time to get to all the different locations is the cost, not the actual time to clean them out. So that's the way we plan to do it. There's one interesting one at Five Rivers we did not long after we got up there, and it was in tussock country, and you would have thought there wouldn't be a lot of runoff in tussock country, but there was a lot of tons of silt come out of that one built by the previous owner, which was I was quite surprised how much silt was in it actually for a native country, but I suppose it's not high quality tussock country, so it's still reasonably openish in the base, I suppose, compared to something that's a bit heavier stocked, if you know what I mean. So there's pluses and minuses of stocking rate and not stocking rates, I suppose, in there. Grass cover.
And I think you've hit on a really good point. I'd like to reference the Pomahaka, the work that Pomahaka has done, and in terms of they've actually measured through ag research some of the sediment reduction and the P and N loss. So it's what it's captured per sediment trap, and that's on your last page of your handout. Or it might be actually a separate bit, but really good stuff, really interesting work being completed by them to actually show that it is actually working, doesn't it?
Yeah, I was trying to remember, was it around a 30% reduction in some of the areas that they were getting because of it?
Yeah.
So
30 to 50 I think in some areas.
Was quite significant.
Yeah.
And if you are aiming for a particular percentage reduction, you do want to stay as close to the NIWA guides as possible for size, because you think during the higher flows that's when it becomes harder to capture sediment once it's entrained, because you have to slow the water down and it has to sit in there circle around a bit and stay kind of still, and then it settles out, and then the water carries on. So you think once it's in trading water, it is kind of hard to get it out unless you've got the right size sediment trap.
I think Keith passed a comment when we were here the other day that we should have had our dam a little bit straighter so it didn't actually flow quite so, it's actually did a bit more of a circle than flow straight through. That taper on the dam would have been better if we'd gone a little bit more like that with it.
Yeah, to sort of square it up against the gully perpendicular, but still have the outlet off to the side would have been good. But can we have a show of hands? Does anyone have a farm plan? You've got one? Yep.
Yeah. So about half the farmers. Yeah, that's good. And is that a beef and lamb farm plan, or is it other beef and lamb? Yeah.
Because yeah, I would add that the farm plan is really helpful to take a good look at your farm and just think about where am I potentially losing contaminants, and your contaminants are nitrogen, phosphorus, E. coli and sediment, and often you batch sediment and phosphorus together and kind of E. coli too, because they all stick together, and so you'll see water running off the hill kind of brown, and that's your phosphorus, sediment and E. coli coming off the hill, and then nitrogen is a bit more difficult. A sediment trap like this will target phosphorus and sediment mainly. It doesn't so much address nitrogen, but growing vegetation above and below will do that to some extent, and nitrogen you want to focus on inputs, so where you're grazing and how much fertiliser you're putting on, and making sure you put that on in appropriate conditions. So in terms of this, when David was driving around with Russell, he would have, in discussion of what was happening on the farm and the topography, the main risk here is the winter grazing in the slope. Even just having stock and slope with critical source areas is kind of all you need to know to build a sediment trap, and then depending on your water system and how much fencing you've got, whether or not you got your water crossings in, you start thinking about these sediment traps. So we've got the overland flow, the farm activities, the contaminant pathway, and then this is intercepting that, and yeah, depending on how it goes, you'll build more or less them. And as we can see, this bund is the key part, and then the outlet off to one side, and as Russell was saying, keyed in the middle so that the water doesn't percolate through it, and you scrape off all the topsoil before you build the bund. And yeah, digger drivers are more expert than me about the appropriate material and techniques for actually building that, but the key design is there.
Boys? Oh, sorry.
Just curious, I probably haven't seen many of these, but like, how important is the depth? Like, are they wide and shallow, or like, do they go to a deep point in the middle, or like, just talk a bit about that?
Yep, so the actual shape. So usually, if you can fit it with the topography, it's longer than it is wide, and it's around 1.5 metres deep at its deepest point. And you want to batter the slopes in, you don't want any steep sides, so you want it to go gently down, and the deepest part will be somewhere in the middle. And it also depends, you're quite restricted on width because a digger can only reach 8 metres give or take with an extended boom, I think. So it's almost always longer than it is wide. And then if you're aiming for, like the guidelines would say you need 40 metres squared per hectare. So for every 40 square metres, 10,000 square metres in a hectare. So it's a smallish bit, but with that sort of gives you an indication of how much square metre area you need, and then the size goes long and wide. Yep.
So for 87 hectare catchment, how big should that have been then?
Without that vegetation in the gully and everything being smoothed off, cultivated, like if all that was farmed 100%, this would need to be 3,200 square metres, which would be like, I wrote it in my notes somewhere, but
Yeah, that's right.
for 87 hectares, yeah. So you'd break it into 3 or 4 or 5 coming down the valley, and because this is also a slightly flatter spot, I'm not sure if it's that obvious, maybe not, but as soon as you build a bund, if it's quite a steep slope, you'll only go back so far before you hit the hill. So you're quite restricted in how much area you can actually get, and you can only build them on these sloped areas because as soon as you get down the flat, you become too much of a waterway and you start getting into resource consent territory. So there are limitations that stop you reaching those size goals, but it's just good to keep in mind if you're aiming for a particular reduction. But yeah, bigger is better, but it really just comes down to the site.
So, like,
don't be put off by size.
You touched on, Keith, that I was a little bit worried the day you come up here that maybe we'd gone to a creek that we should have had a consent on, but this is probably all right. But if we went on to one of our creeks a bit further over here that's a bit bigger, that's definitely a flowing creek and a little bit bigger, then we would need consent to do anything like this on there.
Yep.
So yeah, just be careful where you're putting them.
Usually this is dry.
It does dry off in the summer, yeah.
Has anyone taken into
Occasionally.
consideration weeds and pests in fenced waterways, like driving around, especially down the Aparima, and probably more specifically the dairy farms? The weed and pest issue is going to be huge. It's a gorse and broom.
Yeah, it's an ongoing discussion. No solution is perfect. You simply do something to address an issue and whether or not you create another one. Managing riparian areas, if you fence them, ideally you'd plant them at least one side, because you usually have to get in to excavate, and that halves the problem as soon as you get good vegetation cover on one side to suppress the weeds. In terms of like up the middle of the Aparima, that's an ongoing discussion in Environment Southland, like to how to deal with weeds and not pump so much spray on the river, so that's ongoing. No solutions as yet, but it is a problem.
E. coli, as Russell pointed out, that attracted ducks. Has any research been done on elevated levels of E. coli, avian I guess, below sediment traps?
I'm not aware of the research, but it certainly attracts ducks, and there's some things like planting all the way around the edges with carrot sector and shading them. Sometimes planting trees where you don't need access to the digger can help push them out a bit. They don't like shaded in, crowded areas. Yeah, so if you can cut that out, then it decreases them, but it is a aspect you need to consider under future improvements. You know, you got fencing, you got potentially building more, you got planting, and then reducing a duck problem if you have one would be part of that improvement over time. But yes, elevated E. coli from ducks is a thing. How much it addresses a problem from a health point of view in rivers is debated, because they don't have similar DNA to humans, so it gets complicated.
So that's probably one thing I didn't understand a little while ago, that there's E. coli from sheep is actually quite a lot worse than the E. coli from a lot of the birds, because I just looked at the total E. coli, but it's quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's very expensive to get a rough proportionised E. coli test done, like to figure out how much is from bovine and how much is from avian species. So
We've got about 5 minutes before we can we head back down to site 2 to park up. Any more questions here?
So can I, we've kind of built one of these at home already. I wonder if the bund was in a curve and that the outlet was on the apex of the curve, not in the middle of the curve. Would that be an improvement, you reckon?
well, the way it's written in the guidelines and what David Mola has told me is you keep them off to the side so that during high flows, if you start getting an erosive force, it doesn't take out the main bund. It just it'll scour out a bit of the edge, but it won't destroy the structure. Whereas if you have it right in the middle, yeah, it can go pear-shaped. And I would be interested to see, because it's such a big catchment, how this is going to go with high flows. So that's something you won't really know until it happens. But yeah, the rocked outer edge bit, and there's also like a tiny mini sediment trap just in front of the rock there. And this will hopefully revegetate with grass by the winter.
Sorry, so I suppose on that, as far as it goes, Russell, like the main cost is obviously the cost of the digger work, is it?
Yeah.
As far as
real
construction.
cost, yeah.
There is in your handout, there's a table of, we put the number of hours because digger prices obviously can vary from area to area, and you might have your own digger, so it doesn't cost as much. But so we thought hours was probably a better indication and a better guideline to actually put down. Just to give you, but what? How many hours did you say? It was
Just a 13-tonne digger too, so if you're 20-tonne digger, you're probably not going to air off that. But he was about 3.5 hours here from memory.
Yeah.